Okay, so we're going to have a chat today about Kubernetes, and I suspect I'm similar to a lot of folks, so I think I know a bit about it, but probably not as much as I should do or think I do. And I guess everyone knows that containerized applications is a very good idea. There was maybe a hype around it. I certainly know I followed the Docker hype when that first arrived. So I suppose the first question I'm going to ask you is, Kubernetes, containers, it makes sense, but can you explain sort of why it does and where we're at in terms of who's using Kubernetes, if that's all right?
Yeah. So for those folks that don't know, Kubernetes is an open source platform for orchestrating containers, and that's kind of its key job, is the orchestration of containers. If you don't understand containers, it's like running small virtual machines. They only have the bare essentials of what you need in there to run whatever the application or the thing that you need in that area. And then from an orchestration standpoint, you need to make sure that the things start and stop when you have multiple containers that make up a complex application. You need to be able to coordinate how many of them there are, when they start, when they stop, what to happen when things fail. And that's really the job of an orchestrator.
Okay, and in terms of what's going on as now, do you think most people do understand? Well, I expect most people understand the concept, but they actually understand how it works in practice. And the question would therefore be, do you think there's still more education needed around containers and Kubernetes itself? Or would you say most folks know what's what?
I think it depends on where they are with their adoption, right? And so there are those folks that got in early and really know deeply what's going on. But we got a lot of folks that are still pretty early in their adoption. And one of the benefits of being a later adopter is, of course, you then have a lot more training that's available to help you along, right? You've got certifications, you've got good training programs, and that really makes a difference in bringing yourself along and understanding the technology.
And in terms of the types of organizations, clearly lots of companies are doing slightly different things, etc. I mean, is there a typical organization where Kubernetes makes complete sense, or is it potentially of use to almost any organization, regardless of size and business type, or where's the sweet spot?
Yeah, I mean, it could be used by any organization. Generally, you're going to find kind of a middle to large size organizations, maybe some startups that expect extreme scale, that sort of thing. But that's generally the sweet spot. People that have more complex needs and in a lot of cases have lots and lots of applications, right? So it's not unusual for somebody like a telecom company to have 40 or 50,000 applications in their stable.
And in terms of the benefits, I mean, you've explained the sort of high level, it orchestrates the containers, which, as you say, if you've got all that many applications, you need quite a lot of orchestration, I guess.
Yeah.
But in terms of the benefits it brings, I'm guessing there's things like efficiency, resiliency. So can you sort of flesh that out as to why people will use them in particular?
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately at the end, it's really so that your consumers can get better service, right? That's really what you're gearing towards. Developers can have the flexibility to deploy those applications and work in a way that's beneficial to the way they work, gives them speed to be able to get that kind of work out. And so in a modern organization that's doing digital transformation, it really does allow them to go much faster at getting the business applications they want because at the end of the day, that's really what you care about, is the application itself. Kubernetes is just the train that it rides on.
Okay, and you mentioned that famous phrase, digital transformation. So is it possible for a company to head towards digital transformation or achieve digital transformation without using containers, or is it pretty much a given that if you're going to get the full benefits of digital transformation at some stage, the benefits of containers will be something that you have to get involved with?
I suppose there might be some edge cases where they wouldn't have to do that, but for the most part, lion's share of folks are really going to containerized applications and going to some sort of orchestration to make that easier to do and more manageable. But it's not necessarily something that somebody has to do, but most are. They've found the other benefits to really outweigh trying to do something in some old way.
And in terms of the obstacles, if you like, to people deploying Kubernetes, is education, lack of skills within an organization, would that be the number one sort of stumbling block?
Sometimes it's just stuck in their old ways, right? They're used to doing things a certain way. They have a large hierarchy, and that can be there. Some people think, well, my applications isn't microservices. Microservices is one of those things that makes up the way modern applications are built. But sometimes monoliths are perfectly okay for the kind of application that you're going to build, right? So it's not all about necessarily having to go to something like microservices. There's other places where people think that they have some block or they're thinking about it. Some of it is around, I can't run databases in Kubernetes because years and years ago, when it was primarily for stateless applications, yeah, that was probably true in the earliest versions of Kubernetes. Since then, we've got a lot of work that's happened in the storage layer. All the database vendors are now on Kubernetes, right? And so that sometimes can block. And I think the bigger part sometimes is the hierarchies about how companies are organized, and your application shouldn't necessarily look like your org chart. Your application is a business outcome that you have. And sometimes people have a hard time breaking from their org chart down to what the actual business application is. And some of that has to do with just years and years of doing it a particular way, because that's the way they were organized, but it's not necessarily the best way for the application. So sometimes it's a people and process change as much as it is a technology change.
Okay, yeah, and bearing in mind that point you make, I mean, is there a typical way a company embraces Kubernetes? So I'm wondering, is it top down? So does someone on the board say, I've heard about containers, or I know containers will help us, go away and do it? Or do the DevOps team realize, because they've got the technical knowledge, this is a great idea, containers, Kubernetes, and then go up the stack and say, you know, knock on the boardroom door and say, this is what we've got to be doing? Is there a recommended way of implementing it, I guess?
I think actually, you know, at the very end, I think it really needs the buy-in of the developer, whether you're starting from the top and saying, I really think this is important for our organization from the top of the technology and from the top of the organization. You really need the buy-in from the folks that are going to use it day in and day out. It's your operations folks and it's your development folks. Sometimes that's the same group. A lot of times it's more successful if it's grounds up. And then the other thing I would recommend, in my experience, is if it's kind of coming top down, then definitely have exploratory kinds of work that happens, have groups that really, you know, bring a couple of key applications over. I think that where people get stuck is sometimes they try and start with really small, non-complex applications and say, okay, this works great. And then they try to move to a complex application and realize they haven't fixed their people and process problems, right? So I think all of those are important, but both ways work. And kind of gives a different flavor to it. But at the end of the day, we're in it long enough now that you got a lot of CTOs and CIOs that have actually done this a couple of times, right? They've done a couple of runs through this, so they know where some of the stumbling blocks are for themselves.
Okay, and in terms of your organization, Redis, what's your involvement? You know, Kubernetes. What is it that you do for your customers, helping them with containers and Kubernetes in particular?
So Redis is two things. Redis is an open source community that was built around this in-memory database. And it's also Redis, the company, who's the main primary sponsor of that open source community. And the latter part is where I work in Redis Enterprise, which is taking that open source and really making it consumable for enterprises, to make it so that it's easier for enterprises to handle this technology as it comes to things like compliance and backup and handling things at large scale. And that's really what we help our customers with, is handling those things and handling them at scale in a good way.
Okay, and in terms of the benefits, I'm suspecting you've probably used Kubernetes within your own organization, so it'd be good to know sort of what you maybe have done with it there, as long as you're not giving away too many trade secrets, and maybe what, you know, one or two customers share their journeys again with you. I appreciate names can be sensitive, but if you can give some flavor of what you've been able to do.
Yeah, so we've done a bunch of things with Kubernetes, both internally to increase efficiency in our own operation, be able to service our customers faster, respond to changes a lot faster in the traditional way that our customers are working. We've got a lot of large customers, and heavily in banking, fintech, telecom, folks that have business problems that are running at a larger scale, right? Those are the kinds of companies that are either at the bleeding edge or they have a lot of end consumer customers, right? And so they need to deliver the best experiences for them. We've been able to help folks. So one of the major advantages that we've been able to do is we're an in-memory database. There are things that we can do to not be in memory. but that tends to mean that we're 20x faster than most non-in-memory databases. So for a lot of things, gaming, for things like leaderboards, for financials, making decisions about credit card transactions in the fastest possible time, right? If you think about from when somebody presents a credit card to when the transaction happens, they have to determine if this is fraud or not fraud. How fast can they do that? This is an enabling technology for those kinds of companies that need, very fast sub-millisecond kinds of answers for what's going on, as opposed to many millisecond kinds of answers. And so it makes a big deal. It makes a big difference for them.
Okay, and maybe just as we close, it'd be good. I mean, I think you shared already, you suggested that people start out, they maybe take a too simple application and think they've got it nailed down when they haven't. So when you're starting out on the journey, any advice on that? But also maybe I'm thinking some people are perhaps a little frustrated with what they've achieved so far. So are there any sort of checks to have along the way to know that you are actually doing the best you can do with Kubernetes, as opposed to maybe getting a bit frustrated, or if you come across any of those scenarios?
Yeah, I think the people process part is one of the places where people get frustrated because they've not thought about what the structure should look like. They just copy pasted their org structure and try to go down that way. I think that if you're doing things in the right way and you're iterating on your applications, then you should be able to do multiple application releases per day, per week, depending on if you're a regulated industry and what else you have to do, right, as to how fast you can make changes. But if you're finding that you're able to move at a much faster pace than you were before, so before you might have been deploying an application every 2 to 4 months, and now you're able to do it multiple times per week and multiple times per day to address business needs, that's a huge indicator that you're doing things in the right way and the transformation is happening for you. If you are still stuck and you haven't found any kind of increased speed in what you're doing, you're probably doing something not the right way, and people are probably getting frustrated going, we thought all of this other stuff was going to make it better, going to make it cheaper, is going to make it something else other than what it was, and they're finding that they're not realizing the benefits. And in my experience, that's generally when you need to bring in somebody that's a professional consulting kind of organization to help you kind of through that. And sometimes that's a call for upfront. Bring in people that don't know how to do this, have rinsed and repeated with other customers, and know how to kind of kick you off in the right direction.
Okay, just finally, it occurs to me, I mean, once you've sort of had a play with Kubernetes and worked it out, is it as simple as once you've built a template, you can roll that out to any application, or do you need to be aware that certain applications might be a little bit trickier, both for containers and obviously for the Kubernetes sort of orchestration side, or say, is it one size fits all once you've worked out what works for you?
I think my experience has been small applications and kind of departmental level applications kind of tend to be that repeatable, one size kind of fits all. They roll along, they don't take too long to develop, they have a ton of maintenance to them, and they tend to go pretty easily. Everything else is kind of a one-off, right? Because it really depends on who the end customer is, what kind of traffic are you expecting? You're expecting 1,000 hits per week, 1,000 hits per hour, you're expecting 600,000 hits per second, right? Really depends on the scale of your application. And the higher the traffic, generally the more complex the application gets anyways. And you're generally doing things at a larger scale. And anytime you bring scale, that brings challenges. Now, Kubernetes helps in the scale game because it's built from the ground up kind of to handle those scale challenges, right? That's kind of the genesis of why to do Kubernetes in the first place. But generally, the larger and higher speed it is, the more complex it's going to be by nature. That's the ones that, you might have 3 or 4 of those big applications in your organization, and they probably look quite different from each other. The microservices pattern is one place where people get huge advantages because they can look and say, what are these things that I'm building that other parts of the organization need to use? What other applications need to use this data? For certain things, you don't need to share all that data because it's very contained and doesn't have a use outside of, say, the business function or the department. But then there's other stuff that is used by all parts of the organization. That's a great place where microservices really play a great part, is you can now reuse that logic, that business logic, in other places, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And that's one of the beauties of the microservice architecture, is you then expose it in a way, and in a way that's easy to consume. And I think that's probably the biggest benefit that Kubernetes has had, is helping people do that from a microservice architecture. And Kubernetes itself is really the first API that allows you to kind of control a lot of things in a very, very consistent way. And I think aside from containers, because you can do a lot more with Kubernetes, aside from containers themselves, it's that API everybody's decided to integrate around. And there's such a large ecosystem feeding the Kubernetes, and they're all using the same API to function in the same way. And so from that standpoint, you've got a lot of folks that are even competitors to each other in industry that actually come together in certain parts of Kubernetes to build that API so that it works for everybody. And that way, a lot of the plumbing, what I call the plumbing of the applications, is automatically done, and sometimes done by the folks that know how to do it the best.
Okay, I mean, from what you just said there, because I know whenever something arises, and I'm not saying Kubernetes is new, because it's not, I know it's got a pedigree, but it sounds as if it's one of those technologies that has got a big shelf, because I know some people get a bit nervous, something arrives and think, well, hey, this is great. And then 6 months, a year later, nobody ever heard of it again. Do you think Kubernetes have a sort of unstoppable, as far as anyone can predict? Do you think it's got a big following at it, and the benefits it brings means it's something people can rely on into the future?
Yeah, I think there's a long tail on this. There's certain technologies in my experience in the industry. I got 35 years in the industry. I've seen a lot of things come and go, and there's a few really big things that were those big changing technologies that made the difference. Things like Java, things like virtualization, right, were those things that really lasted a long time and had legs on them. And this is one of those kinds of technologies that I would expect to still be here a decade later.
Okay, it's been great to chat to you, Brad. So appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you.